Okay, so recording has started. Okay, so hi everyone. Uh, Today I have Magnus Winding with me, and so I'm going to introduce Magnus. So Magnus Vinding is the author of Speciesism, Why It Is Wrong and Implications of Rejecting It. He's also the author of another book, Reflections on Intelligence, and another book, You Are Them, another book, Effective Altruism, How Can We Best Help Others, and Suffering Focused Ethics, Defense and Implications, and Reasoned Politics. He received a degree in mathematics from University of Copenhagen and is co-founder of Center for Reducing Suffering. Okay, so how are you doing, Magnus?
Hi, Rajat. I'm doing great, thanks. How about you?
I'm doing great too. Just for the audience, Magnus Winding is like, in my view, I think Magnus Winding is like legendary right now because uh, his uh, his his articles are excellent. Like he has replied to I think Richard Yetter Chapel, and Johann Gustafsson, right? Uh, Two of the uh, major philosophers in like utilitarianism, right? Am I correct in that?
Uh, I suppose. I mean, to be honest, I'm not. I can't claim to know much about their status as such within academia. I guess other people can better comment on that.
Okay, yeah, yeah. They are both, I think, they are both academics, Johann Gustafsson and Richard H. Chappell. They're both pretty good, in my view. So I suppose my first question to you, since this is like a very casual, informal, yeah, chat. So my first question is like, what is your favorite music band?
Oh, my favorite band. That's a difficult one. I used to be a huge fan of the band Queen. I had almost a musical obsession with that band, so probably I'll go with that.
Have you listened to like Radiohead and other bands?
Radiohead. Not so much, actually. No.
Okay. Any recent? Do you listen to pop music recently? Pop music, rock music?
Yeah. I consume pretty much all kinds of music. Yeah.
Yeah, great. I also like pretty much have uh, like lots of music, from all kinds of genres, metal to rock to pop, you know. Yeah. I suppose. What's your favorite movie?
Oh, my favorite movie. So recently I saw a movie that's called Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah.
And I think, well, it's certainly the best one I've seen in recent times. It's really good. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I have watched that movie too. I think it's one of the best experiences I have ever, experienced. It's really amazing, wonderful movie.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
very deep.
yeah. Do you play video games?
No, I don't.
Oh, that's sad. I mean, like, I think playing video games is like a thing in objective lists.
Yeah,
Freezes your well-being. You know.
something is missing in my life, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So, anyways, I suppose my first question to you is like, how did you get into like consequentialism or utilitarianism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, actually, I guess something that played a big role in my own development in that direction was Sam Harris, specifically his book, The Moral Landscape. Because before being exposed to that book and those ideas, I don't think I'd heard about utilitarianism or consequentialism or even ethics. So in that sense, I felt a bit betrayed by my um, education system. I had to go on YouTube to hear about these ideas. So that was how I initially got interested in it. And then I guess eventually later on, I discovered some other thinkers who inspired me greatly. One of them was David Pierce, whose views have I know he's been on your podcast as well. He's
Yes.
influenced my views a great deal, and I owe him yeah a great intellectual debt in that sense, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah. I think for me, my views were like changing. with respect to normative ethics, my views were like changing continuously. I was a moderate deontologist one time, then a utilitarian, then I think virtue ethicist, then again utilitarian, or like then I think I'm currently a consequentialist. Again, like the order of like changing of my beliefs are not like correct order, like they are. I'm just like saying randomly like that I found all of these like ethical normative ethical theories to be plausible at some point.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
then I have to like check. Then I checked more like what seems like most plausible among them all. I came across like repugnant conclusion and stuff. You know, population ethics. You know, so
Right.
yeah, like uh, uh, it's. I think recently I have like since I'm like uh, recently I've been like a lot more interested in philosophy from like I think 2021, like a lot more. So I looked up a lot with respect to ethics, like deontology, duty based kind of rights based kind of deontology, mostly moderate deontology, because I think like the sort of absolute deontology where it's like it's always wrong to lie no matter what, that just seems like very implausible to me. That just makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I don't think many people endorse that kind of view, like even among people who call themselves deontologists these days. So I think Kant was quite an exception in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, I read like a recent book on Kant, a book by a respected philosopher. I think his name is Alan Wood. He wrote like a book called Kantian Ethics. Now, his book does make Kantianism somewhat more plausible, but it's still like Kantian ethics does not. I mean, of course, there's like Christine Korsgaard. Have you heard of her? Like, she has like, yeah,
Yeah,
presented.
yeah. So she's the author of the book Fellow Creatures, and she's also yeah. So she's written about like a Kantian extension into the realm where you also take non-human animals seriously in moral terms, which Kant didn't do properly, you
Yeah,
could say.
yeah, that's the thing. And I mean, the whole thing with like, it seems to place rationality in a very central front, rationalism and stuff. I personally am more often like intuitionist, like, G.E. Moore, and like Ross, W.D. Ross, and like Michael Humer and stuff. So I have like more intuitionistic kind of methodology, because I mean intuitionism also like works well with aesthetics, right? Like uh, if someone is an like ethical intuitionist or moral realist, they can also be like aesthetic realist based on intuitionism, right? So it works well with aesthetics and ethics. What is like your view on like meta ethics?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated, I guess you can say. So, um, I might be inclined to call myself a realist naturalist if I had to pick a view, but I also have the impression that many people, well, what many people understand by naturalism is not necessarily something I would endorse. But I should also say that, so I think I used to be somewhat more focused on meta ethics.
Hmm.
But then more recently, I've come to the view that I think it seems more important to focus on normative ethics.
Hmm.
Is my take, which isn't to say that meta ethics is unimportant, but I
Yeah,
just think that it seems to me like there's perhaps more room for progress, so to speak,
yeah,
in normative
absolutely.
ethics.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. Like, uh, with normative ethics, you have like recently there are like a lot of works like Johann Gustafsson like released a recent paper like money pump arguments that seem to have influence on normative ethics too. Because he's like I think talked about like I think expected value, expected utility theory. So, like,
Yeah, and another
yes,
point that's worth making is that I mean, so oftentimes people can agree on normative ethics, but not necessarily agree on meta ethics, and then I think there can just be I'm not saying this is always the case, but sometimes it can be a bit of a wasted opportunity. Like especially if you do have like perhaps effective and effective altruism like mindset, then it does make sense to consider where it makes most sense to spend one's energies.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
so
I mean, I
sometimes it
think,
can just be a bit of a I mean, I feel in meta ethics it's one of those areas. I mean, so of course it's that's common in many areas, but it's one of the areas where it's perhaps most common for people to talk past each other. I sense that often the terminology just isn't so clear, and it's often a lot less clear than people perhaps assume.
yeah, yeah, I think it's also very technical, like irreducible normativity and like supervenience, and like it gets into like metaphysics and stuff too, you know. So, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that's why I'm like also generally much more like interested in normative ethics and applied ethics, like if you have like watched some of my previous videos, like recently I talked with Amos Wolin, who I talked with him about Pascal's wager, because like my interests are also in like philosophy of religion, right? Because I mean I personally believe in God, right? But of course it's not like uh, strange god who like sends people to eternal hell, literal eternal torture, or like annihilates people. I'm more of like my view is more like universalist kind of god, kind of optimistic, compassionate, you know
Oh,
yeah.
oh, that's interesting. So, um, a compassionate God, you say?
Yeah, benevolent, yeah, omnibenevolence, yeah, compassionate, loving, just, good, merciful, yeah.
But then presumably not omnipotent, or what would you say there?
I mean, I do think he's a tri-omni god. So yeah, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. And yeah, I know this is like might head into like problem of evil and stuff. And yeah, it's a problem of evil. I consider problem of evil and problem of suffering to be a serious problem for like omnibenevolence. You know. So yeah, I mean, I have my own responses, my own thoughts, like how to like uh, respond to the problem of evil in a compassionate manner, not like dismissive manner, like some theists just dismiss problem of evil as like an emotional problem, you know and like I don't do that. I think it's a serious problem, like I take suffering very seriously. Like that is why, like, when I read your paper, like, uh you were responding to Toby Ord, right?
Right,
And I
yeah.
read that. Yeah, it was an excellent, magnificent paper. Very, very clear. Very, very brilliant. So
Thanks
in
for
that, yeah, in that paper, I lean toward like lexical threshold negative utilitarian view, though I, of course, modify it a little bit to make it more consequentialist. And do some desert adjustment here and there. But yeah, it's like a lot more. Is your view lexical threshold negative utilitarian?
Yeah, so it's certainly true that it's fair to call my view a lexical view, certainly. So, for
Yeah,
instance, I don't think that there's uh, any number of pinpricks that's worse than an instance of torture.
yeah,
But then, when you say threshold, the thing is that one can hold a lexical view without necessarily endorsing, well, at least without necessarily endorsing a sharp threshold. So
yeah,
how one exactly formalizes it, it's you can say it can be a somewhat complicated matter, and it is possible, for instance, for example, one could hold a lexical view and then be somewhat agnostic about how to best formalize it. So one could think that maybe it's plausible to have some kind of very sharp threshold, or alternatively, it's also possible to have what you might call more of a gradual threshold, and like there are different kinds of views of how that might be done. One approach is has been laid out in a paper that's called I think it's called Many-Valued Logic in Value Theory by Simon Knudsen, and yeah, that's something that people can look up in case they're interested. But so the thing is that there is some yeah, a variety of options in terms of how exactly one formalizes it. But it's true that I would characterize my view as a lexical, suffering focused view.
Yeah. Yeah. Like David Pierce has been like an important influence on me too. Like he's an important influence on you. I think David Pierce was among some of the first philosophers who I have heard of, because like I really liked his view. I think all other like ethical theories I find to be not as compassionate. I find, of course, I mean, like classical utilitarianism and hedonism seems to lead to like utility monsters and stuff. Like, so like happy utility monsters are like, they get happiness, extreme amounts of happiness if they like eat people. But of course, Richard Yetter Chapel like one time showed how like intuitions flip when a utility monster is like a suffering kind of a monster who is like experiencing extreme amounts of suffering if he doesn't eat people.
Yeah.
Then the intuitions kind of flip, because suffering seems to be the thing that we want to like reduce. Like we focus on reducing suffering more than like just increasing pleasure, because it seems to me like when a pleasure reaches a certain level, we do not really care much about like increasing it further for people, but we do care if people are like really suffering or something. Yeah. So like negative leaning, any kind of negative leaning sort of utilitarianism is, I think, much more plausible than sort of classical ones that that like just aggregate pleasure and pains like so easily, that seems to alienate some of our major like intuitions about like compassion and love and stuff.
Yeah, like one can, I think it's worth asking the question, perhaps because it's so often assumed, to ask the question that why and how should a given amount of pleasure somewhere outweigh extreme suffering elsewhere. So, I mean, I think many people take that kind of trade-off to be more or less axiomatic, but I think it's worth trying to spell out the why of it, and to clarify what actually might justify that view.
Yeah, just a second, I need to like turn on the fan, I suppose.
Yeah.
Turn on like the AC, because like while I'm talking, it's like it just like when I'm like talking and thinking, things just I get like hot, exhausted. I don't know.
Okay.
Because really like thinking, I think thinking exhausts, deep thinking sometimes exhausts people.
Yeah, it certainly can. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Okay, great. Yeah. So, you know, have you like also like looked into some other normative ethical theories? Like there is like natural law theory, generally some theists. Yeah.
I haven't explored that. No, not really.
Yeah, I mean it's weird. It's like the pretty much always I'm like I think natural law theory, at least used by some of the theists, some of the people who have like traditionalist sort of inclinations, they seem to like pretty much use natural law theory to like say that uh, like in some sense LGBTQ plus people should not like live their happy lifestyles even if there is like literally no harm to anyone else and even if there is no harm to themselves because it's just like wrong you know even if there is like no suffering or death or harm, it's just intrinsically wrong or something. So
And then it's wrong because it's that has some theistic basis, Owen.
like they would say from an I heard an argument, I read an argument, it's called a perverted faculty argument. So that argument says that it is just wrong to frustrate the functions, essential functions of our organs, and it is just wrong based on it's just intrinsically wrong based on their view.
That's interesting. I mean, it sounds actually a little bit like the kind of teleological view that you could find in ancient times, maybe Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius as well.
Yes,
But
Aristotle, Aquinas. Yeah,
what? Sorry.
Aristotle or Aquinas,
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I guess it's the sort of view that's at the very least strongly challenged by like our modern evolutionary understanding, in the sense that, or even just one could just say that perhaps it's a bit akin to a naturalistic fallacy, in the sense that why should we think that something is
yeah,
necessarily right or good just because it's in some sense natural?
yeah. I personally do not know how it avoids naturalistic fallacy. Like, I mean, of course, the proponents of this argument say we avoid naturalistic fallacy, but I mean, I don't know how they do that. I don't know how can they do that, because to me, when I heard that argument, it just did not make any sense to me. Like when there is like no harm, no suffering, no death, I just don't know what went wrong, what was wrong. Like even if there's even no potential harm, even if there's no potential future harm or anything,
Or
right?
it could even be helpful in the sense that what about organ transplants? Would they oppose that?
Yeah, I mean they oppose organ transplants and like
Okay.
cases. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So they are not like natural law theory. From what I read, like I read from like Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So from that, I found that it has some things in common with consequentialism, and it also has some things in common with deontology.
Hmm.
So it's are you hearing some sort of disturbances
Well,
from?
just a little bit. It's nothing major.
Yeah, okay, great. Because like people are like doing firecrackers and stuff,
Oh yeah.
because it's like Diwali season, in India.
What's that?
It's like a festival,
Oh, I see.
so firecrackers, people enjoy firecrackers and stuff during
Right.
this month, so yeah, I'm sorry about that, for that
That's okay.
disturbance. But yeah, so like the thing with the thing I always loved about consequentialism is that like the focus is on like states of affairs, world, individual. I think the focus is like very broad, and it's that seems like sensible to me rather than just just this weird thing like like have you heard of like Bernard Williams' case against like consequentialism?
Well, yeah, I've heard some of his arguments. Yeah, like
Yeah, like
well,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, just one that I recall was how it could, I mean, according to him, I mean, I think broadly he thought that it was too demanding, at least utilitarianism, and that it could have harmful effects on our psychology. So yeah, and also, of course, I've also heard him make some arguments about how just how one would go about calculating things is well, tricky to say the least, which of course he's right about. But that doesn't necessarily suggest that you have a better alternative, might be a reply.
Yeah, I mean, I think he gives this strange analogy where, like, there is like a tyrant, and that tyrant orders you to kill one Native American person, or that tyrant will kill like other 19. Like, he will really kill other 19 if you do not kill one. So, and that's true. Like, let's assume it is like really true. He will do that. And if you kill one person, then he will really not kill the other native, persons. So
Yeah.
to me, it's obvious, like, okay, one loss is less than like 19 losses, right? 19 deaths are worse than one death. To me, that's obvious.
Right.
Yeah. So that's why, like, this is my consequentialist leanings right here, saying,
Right.
like, look, 19 deaths are worse than one death. Simple as that. We should not be doing this weird stuff. Like, Bernard Williams say, like, you should keep your hands clean. Like, you should not, like,
Yeah.
kill someone because it's always wrong, and stuff like that. And I thought, well, no. No, I mean, if you have to, like, prevent, like, literal disaster, moral disaster, why would you not do that? Right? You have to, like, pretty much consider, what is the greater good, pretty much always, I think.
Yeah.
So that's like a weird analogy that I think just made me, like, not really care what Bernard Williams says about utilitarianism, because I mean that's just like very strange objection to me, to utilitarianism always has been.
Well, it might be dangerous though to dismiss a critic just because if they might make one unconvincing objection, they might still
Yeah,
have valuable things to say.
yeah, of course. I mean, you are right. You're right. I mean, I should be charitable here. I mean, of course, but yeah, I mean, other criticisms I have heard of by Bernard Williams of utilitarianism is that uh, he was more leaning to, like, moral particularism, you know. So moral particularism, I cannot pronounce it properly. So, like, he seems to hold, like, particular particularist views, uh, which is to say, like, he's against moral theorizing.
Yeah, and I think well, so I think one can actually see at
Yeah,
least some significant grains of truth in that, in
yeah,
that
yeah,
it can be very there are many pitfalls um, when one is trying to calculate optimal outcomes, right? Because it's one thing to consider abstract, isolated thought experiments, but it's quite another when it comes to the real world, right? So the thought experiment that you just raised about killing a person. So if one posted in a real world context, then things would suddenly change a lot, right? And I think what some people, I mean, you could also just say that abstract theorizing, well, at least it appears to have a somewhat questionable track record in terms of people who set out with good intentions, but who then ended up doing horrible things. And the thing is just when you also combine it with the fact that human beings have the tendency to be self-deceived, we have remarkable capacities to rationalize virtually anything.
Yeah.
in light of that, it does make sense that well, that many philosophers are pretty insistent on trying not to, what can you say, perhaps give in too easily or at least too naively uh, to, overarching abstract symbol theories.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. I mean, though of course.
And
So, go ahead.
I say that as someone who, I mean, I do actually find the sort of general theory approach to be the most plausible one ultimately. But I also think one has to approach it in extremely sophisticated ways. And that can be very challenging. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned there from, the, you might say, yeah, like the deontologists and the virtue theorists and so on, in terms of how one can in practice best realize, some consequentialist aim, such as reducing extreme suffering.
Preventing extreme suffering, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, ideally.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I do think there is like a lot of plausibility to like moderate deontology and virtue ethics. It's just that consequentialism just is much more plausible than both of them personally. But I think the thing with virtue ethics is that like uh, you can make virtue ethics in terms of like consequential, yeah, consequentialism, right? Because like a virtuous person will do will bring about what is like the best compared to any other alternative, you know.
There are at least, yeah, some consequentialists have made that case, and I think they are quite right to a large extent, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, I also have like that understanding of virtue too, because the thing with virtue ethics is that of it focuses on character rather than specific actions, right? But again, we have to like when we are thinking about virtue ethics, we have to question what would a good person do, you know, what is the good thing, you know, because yeah, like a good person would be sensitive to values that are just out there, like pleasure, beauty, compassion, love, justice, so yeah, he will care about that. So I think virtue ethics is compatible with, I think, consequentialism. Virtue ethics is,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
like one could even say that perhaps virtue ethics, in some ways, it might fit better with human psychology in some ways, right? Because calculating about consequences, especially like in a very big picture way, is just very, very difficult compared to, for example, uh, having an aspiration to be honest and kind and courageous and so on, right? So as a matter of how you approach decisions,
yeah,
it might be more helpful. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that. I mean, a consequentialist would, of course, say that, especially when it comes to the big decisions in your life, that's where it makes sense to calculate. But
yeah,
maybe, I mean, this relates to an important distinction in consequentialist thinking, namely that between like consequentialism as a criterion of rightness versus consequentialism as a decision procedure, right? And many consequentialists, I think all the way back to Henry Sidgwick, have argued that, yeah, it's important to distinguish those, and that oftentimes a consequentialist criterion of rightness would
yeah,
actually not recommend consequentialist decision procedures. And perhaps this is sometimes uh, a bit neglected among consequentialists. Like I think
yeah,
they might do well to focus even more on like developing good character,
yeah,
which is a very, I think also Aristotle was onto something when he made this distinction between knowing what and knowing how. And like being virtuous can be seen as perhaps more of a skill to be developed than just merely a matter of acquiring information or knowledge. And perhaps it's a fair point that consequentialists in practice have tended to neglect like actually training in certain virtues. And I think it is important because that is the kind of thing that can help you well guard against certain biases and unfortunate tendencies. For example, when it comes to something like um, temptations to lie or otherwise do questionable things.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I think that's an important distinction too. Like, consequential decision procedure is different than a consequentialist view of the good, right?
Yeah, like in principle, consequentialists could. I mean, there's a wide diversity in terms of what a consequentialist might endorse and even likely would endorse at the practical level. Right? And one could also support that with, you know, more modern literatures within, sometimes it goes under the name of bounded rationality, which I think like a core result there is that sometimes simple rules actually just do better than more complicated ones. It's not always the case, but sometimes, which of course that's something that consequentialists should take seriously and try to, what can you say, act on.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely true. So, my next question to you is like, what do you think about, like, sort of desert adjusted versions of consequentialism?
So my immediate thought is that I mean, I would perhaps distinguish between, like, again, a theoretical versus a practical level.
Yeah.
I think at the practical level, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, so even if you are just purely impartial and don't care about dessert per se, at the theoretical level, you would still, of course, want a judicial practice and like an everyday practice that reflects like some version of our notion of dessert, right? Um, as for the theoretical level, well, maybe I would say, I mean, I lean strongly towards a view that doesn't see dessert as being important in itself. Um, I mean, perhaps I could, yeah, I mean, I guess I'd stand by that claim, yeah.
Yeah, so you believe desert is like important, even theoretically, right?
No, so the reverse in the sense that I think it's very important to take into account at the practical level, but I don't consider that plausible at the theoretical level.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Like, when I think about desert, I'm more like thinking about, like, I suppose, retributive justice.
Right.
Like, I
Yeah.
mean, people have retributive intuitions,
And
right?
I think so one reason I might give for not being compelled by it is that, for example, I um I think that it's plausible to hold what one might call a reductionist view of personal identity, or perhaps rather an empty individualist view or open individualist view. I don't think those two are actually substantively different, at least necessarily. And if one holds that kind of view, for example, an empty individualist view that views, for example, every experience moment as being, in some sense, a different person, then it doesn't actually make sense if you, let's say, punish a string of experience moments for something that happened earlier or was done earlier. I mean, of course, it can still, as mentioned, make a lot of sense at the practical level. But yeah, purely as a theoretical matter, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. Or you could even think about it in terms of like different parts of the brain. So, for example, the part that initiated a decision to do a terrible act isn't necessarily the part that actually suffers, probably occurs somewhere else. I mean, of course, it's not entirely separated in a neat way. But yeah, I think those kinds of arguments can also help make you at least question those kinds of retributivist intuitions.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing with retributivist intuitions, I mean, they are strong, but they can be weakened when we think more about them, right? They initially seem strong, right? Like if someone hurts you or me, it feels bad, and it also feels like they should be hurt to like know what it feels like, to be hurt, you know. So, and I mean, the thing with retribution also is that, I mean, it's not something that is like valuable, that is like we need to make situations such that there is like more retribution or anything like that. I think retribution is more like something bad already happened. To fix that something bad, retribution seems to be like required, or like there's this strong feeling like, perhaps it has like the semi hedonistic justification for like retribution, right? Like the victim would feel pleasure
Right.
if their attacker suffers.
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, so I think perhaps one could say that in evolutionary terms, it makes a lot of sense that we would have those kinds of feelings, right? In terms of, um, yeah, disincentivizing bad acts going forward, right? And so I think, yeah, one could perhaps make a rather plausible evolutionary debunking argument against retributivist intuitions in the sense of saying that's exactly the kind of intuition that you would expect to have and that you would expect to be adaptive in a context where people are um, acting badly. Like you would expect that we would have evolved intuitions and strong impulses to punish that, right?
Yeah.
And I think maybe I think the hedonistic account, it can sound a little bit like, to me, like perhaps a rationalization sort of overlaid on this actual underlying evolutionary story. I mean, of course, one could say it might be true that there's some pleasure there, but yeah, I think the pleasure is not really so much the purpose, and like especially also if, for example, if you hold a suffering focused view, then it's not as though the pleasure of retribution could outweigh the suffering, at least on a typical such view.
Yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, if we have like lexical, view that some suffering cannot be outweighed by any amount of pleasure, then like, yeah, I would agree. Yeah. I mean, I suppose the thing with like desert adjustment, I suppose, yeah, this is like a complicated issue with desert and stuff, right? Because initially people do want to cause suffering to the one who caused them suffering. But when they realize that the person who caused them suffering was like also probably in some kind of like mental illness, right? Like that person was themselves like mentally ill. It was like the person also perhaps was maybe born that way, right? So it's like if some animal like hurts you, why would you hurt it back? Like that's the intuition that people can have that runs counter, that runs counter to retributivism.
Yeah, like over and above the effects on future incentives. Yeah, there's the question of why.
Yeah. So I mean, what I personally do with retributivism is like I say, I mean, I do not think retributivism requires agency. So if like a literal robot hurt you, a robot, right? I mean, I do not think there's like any wrong if you hurt that robot, you know. So if an animal like hurts you, hurting it back, of course, I mean, it like still increases suffering, right? Unnecessary suffering, I suppose. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it's
so
weird. Sorry, go ahead.
it is of course unnecessary if we've set aside and said that it's not going to like prevent any future suffering or have other potentially desirable effects.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. How would you like go about like, because like I think moderate deontologists, the reason people are moderate deontologists, one important reason is retribution. Desert. Moral desert, I think.
Right. Yeah, and I think it is possible to have um, so to speak, to consequentialize the core of that in the sense that, it does make sense that if someone wrongs you, um, you obviously you wouldn't want to reward it,
Yeah.
and you very likely would want to actually punish that, um, probably in some fairly proportional way
Yeah.
in order to prevent future instances of it, right? At least
Yeah.
typically.
Yeah. Yeah. Like have you read this paper by Tim Xiao? He has
No, I don't
like,
think so.
yeah, so he has defended like factory farming, you know.
Well,
He has defended factory farming by saying like it's not cruel because animals are not rational, and stuff. And he has defended like retributivism, and a kind of retributivism that is like the desert itself is a good. So even if there is no like future benefits to causing suffering to the you know attacker, it is still good to punish him for the sake of desert. Yeah.
yeah, and I suppose, I mean, my basic reply would be that that's pretty much exactly what one would expect our intuitions to loudly declare, and to have that kind of feeling. But yeah, I mean, so
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be curious as to what he thinks warrants that judgment or evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, he's like a natural law theorist too, so
Okay.
he's like a more like traditionalist kind of natural law theorist, because natural law theory also has like different versions, you know. So he's more like a traditionalist kind of a natural law theorist who believes that like rationality is important for morality, agency is important for like retribution, you know free will is important for like punishing someone. So
Right.
so he thinks like the justification is just, I think he would say like it is intuition. It is an
Right.
intuition that desert is good in itself.
Yeah. That might be a good example of where people might reach an impasse, because I obviously I don't. Well, I guess you might say that in an immediate sense, I might share the intuition, but it doesn't really
Yeah.
stand up to scrutiny in my case. So.
Okay. Yeah. 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 Do you think other intuitions of like perhaps aesthetics can be debunked that way?
Um, I mean, one could perhaps make as fairly plausible arguments, right? So I don't know, you might, yeah. So one could. It sort of also depends on perhaps what people find beautiful, but like if it's something that is of obvious adaptive value in an evolutionary sense, then yeah, it would perhaps be somewhat obvious and plausible to make that kind of argument. But again, I mean, I think even there with aesthetics, it can actually, I think, be worth distinguishing the intrinsic versus the extrinsic value, because I think this might be something that consequentialists can also have a tendency to ignore,
Yeah,
how aesthetics can actually be at the very least instrumentally important as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, personally, I'm a consequentialist too. So I mean, I personally think aesthetics are like, yeah, not just instrumentally important, but like it's just important, you
Right.
know.
What's
Uh,
an example of something that you consider like intrinsically valuable or important in the realm of aesthetics?
yeah. So like, suppose a beautiful world where there is like grass, trees and stuff, and like, or like beautiful paintings, uh, like symmetry and stuff, and even if there is like literally no human being there, no animal, no suffering, nothing, that world seems to me still beautiful than a world where it's like a dump, a symmetry, you like a literal, yeah. Like I think a trashy world, which is a trashy world, which is an ugly world, is less, uh, has less worth, moral worth, than a
Right.
world with more like beauty, aesthetics, and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned uh, green grass and trees, because that ties a little bit back to what I said about what one might expect or predict based on like evolutionary aesthetics, because an environment like that would presumably be more
Yeah.
desirable than a completely barren landscape, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like it's about health, right? Like green grass, trees seem like that's where we like developed in generally, we did not, and other things that are like dump and all those stuff, that's like unhealthy, so like, yeah, I understand that there could be explanations, but I think forget that too. Like if forget grass and trees, uh, just if there's like a symmetry or like, you know beautiful like, uh, buildings and stuff, I think that they are beautiful too, so like, even if it's like, uh not green, even if
yeah,
it does not seem like trees are there, or like, but there's still like, there is like a symmetry there, there's like some sort of like beauty seems to be some sort of have like this universalist concept where, uh, there are some things that are like universally beautiful, like universally preferable to like
yeah.
every person who is like, uh, uh, normal and, sane, you know.
Yeah, you might be interested in a book that's called, I believe it's called The Aesthetic Human.
Yeah.
And it actually looks at beauty and aesthetics from an evolutionary perspective. And I
Yeah.
actually have the book, but haven't read it yet. But I think also when it comes to, I mean, I would guess that it's somewhat of an open question why symmetry is commonly seen as beautiful. I mean, there could be various reasons, but
Yeah. Yeah.
one of them might be that it it uh, it may have been helpful in terms of that symmetric mates would have been like had higher fitness in the
Mm.
ancestral environment. So that could at least be one
Mm.
potentially plausible explanation, part of the picture. But I mean, obviously, yeah, I don't know about that, but you might find it interesting to look into that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. But of course, I mean, when you also think about like bring in if there is like a god, right? Then you can, but some theists will say, well, God, uh, you know, made evolution such that people will appreciate these values like beauty, pleasure, love, friendship, and stuff, right? Like
Well,
if
yeah, although I guess in using that line of argument, one could also take that a bit further and say that that could make an argument, at least against any kind of compassionate God, in the sense that
yeah,
humans also enjoy many viceful things, right? So, for example,
yeah,
beating the competitor, and you can just see how, for example, in Rome, how many people enjoyed watching gladiator fights and so on, right? So
yeah,
there are also many ugly fascinations, right?
yeah, of course, that's true. Like it also like depends on, yeah, of course, like theists will have different answers for that, like why did people value those, because like personally I do not think like sadistic pleasure, like if there is no harm, then I do not think sadistic pleasure, if there is no harm or suffering or death, then I do not think sadistic pleasure is like some kind of a bad thing. Like I mean, since you do not play video games, but like in video games there is like, you can like there's a game called like GTA, Grand Theft Auto, so like in GTA 5 or GTA 4 people can like you like throw missiles at people, you know, uh, like run over people, like in those sorts of video games. So I mean,
Right.
since there is like no actual harm to like people, no actual suffering or like death or anything, so
Yeah.
I mean, it's not
I mean,
that
of
bad.
course, I think
Yeah.
it's a bit of a contentious issue whether video games are harmful or even beneficial. But I suppose at least as a general matter, one could say that, for instance, even if sadistic pleasures don't necessarily cause direct harm, one could still think that
Yeah.
they are best discouraged. A bit
Mm.
analogous to the way Kant thought about harming other animals, right? That one could think that it could still, in the real world, instill some unfortunate tendencies in terms of how people think and maybe eventually act. And similarly, or another argument, which I myself, I should say, don't find all that plausible, but as you may know, um, a friend of mine, Brian Tomasic, he has written some essays about whether beings in computer simulations might be sentient. And so,
Yeah.
whether or
Yeah.
not one buys that argument, I mean, one could, if one assigns that argument some degree of plausibility, then that could also count as at least a weak reason to avoid that. But yeah, I'm just putting that out there as something that people can consider.
Yes, of course. I mean, like I've read Brian Tomasic's, yeah, that paper or that article. I think it was also an interview with like Vox, you know.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I've read that. I felt that like there are also like other ways to look at it. Like I mean, like he like of course he finds that the current algorithms are like very simple, so they just seem to have like just basic non-feeling kind of desires, like desire to like shoot the player when the player is seen, you know so I mean, in some sense, the fact that they are shooting the player and the player is shooting them back, like their desire is being fulfilled too, right? But of course, like if someone could say like desire violation is worse than desire fulfillment. So yeah, I mean, but still, I think the desire violation, it's not really desire violation if the person is still sane. The person is not really dying, right? Technically, like the person is like has like infinite lives technically, because
Yeah.
yeah, because it's not like an individual piece of consciousness that once dead is just destroyed. there's no same person there or like consciousness or anything. It's just
Yeah,
like same code, you know, with
it
reskins and stuff. Yeah.
this of course ties into discussions in the philosophy of mind, and where um,
Yeah.
it's what you just said. I myself tend to agree with that, but of course there are other views in the philosophy of mind that takes a different position. Like some functionalists, I believe, would
Yeah.
do actually think that certain line of code or program could be a conscious subject, whereas
Yeah.
I myself, I think someone like David Pierce is actually yeah, he has some great critiques of that view, I think.
Yeah.
um, Also, Mike Johnson has written uh, an essay against functionalism. And yeah, I do think that those critiques are pretty compelling. But all that said, it's also worth approaching these issues with intellectual humility. And I
Yeah.
think that is actually something that perhaps sometimes that's, I mean, I think one should be cautious in both directions. Like sometimes there's a bit too much of a tendency to just uh, like strongly assume that, for example, a line of code or a digital computer uh, is necessarily conscious. I mean, I think that's far from obvious.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, like the functionalist can like object to what I said by saying that it is conscious, some line of code or something. Yeah. Yeah, functionalists can do that, but I mean, I'm more of, with respect to philosophy of mind, I think I'm more of like a dualist and like leaning
Oh,
towards some sort of,
right.
yeah, idealism, because I mean, yeah, I believe in God, right? So it's generally people who believe in God are like dualists about mind. So like they are not generally people who believe in God are not, you know, physicalists.
Yeah, though it depends on what kind of God, right? So, I mean, this
Yeah,
is,
of course. Yeah.
so I suppose, and I was actually initially curious about whether the kind of God, because as you know, there is the kind of Spinozian God, right? Which one could
Yes.
argue is in some sense perhaps a quote physicalist God, in the sense that it might just be seen as, I think that's how it's understood, as just it's the natural world that you call God, which of course some would argue is a bit misleading in terms of how the word is commonly used.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So
But
our my
briefly, you
yeah,
said
yeah.
idealism.
Sorry. Go ahead.
It's I just wanted to, and I mentioned David Pierce. It's worth noting that the view that he defends, he actually, and which I think sounds pretty plausible, he calls that physicalist idealism. So in fact, tying those two seemingly contradictory views together. And I believe, although I haven't studied his work very closely, but I believe the author Bernardo Castrop
Yeah.
defends a similar view.
Okay. Okay. So here's my next question. Have you like looked into like David Hume?
Looked into, so I guess broadly familiar with his work, but I haven't studied it very closely. Um, I know that what was it? So in one of his pieces, I think some of his considerations on religion, I quoted those in my book Suffering Focused Ethics, where I was quite surprised at how he expressed a very pessimistic view, in fact, David Hume, there in those passages. So I found that very interesting. And then, of course, I also know that his views on like personal identity, seem to be fairly similar to my own view, and his, of course, view of moral sentiments is, of course, well known, and I guess I probably have both some agreements and disagreements with him there.
Yeah, same here. I think he's also a good writer. I think, as far as I know, I think he's like a respected writer compared to other writers like Kant, and others.
I think very clear for his time, but I don't know whether it also helps. I feel that the English language, at least when I compare to things written in Danish, uh, like historical texts, I find it's generally much easier to read English ones. So I don't know whether that might also give them a bit of an advantage.
Oh, so you find like reading history in English easier?
Well, historical texts often, yeah, I find that there's a greater similarity somehow.
Okay. Yeah, English is a pretty cool language. I think. Yeah, I think it's yeah it's yeah. So when like I suppose this like gets into like expected utility theory kind of. So like, have you heard of like Pascal's wager?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of it?
Well, I mean, you could say I'm not convinced by it, and
Yeah.
so and I think there are various reasons. So one is just that you could say what exactly would the wager entail ultimately, right? Because you could say that don't you have wagers from different religions, and then you might have conflicting wagers making conflicting claims about what you should wager on. So yeah, I mean, and when you look at all those things together, it's not really clear that it makes much sense to focus on any particular wager. And you could even argue that, okay, if we are dealing in wagers on very large or infinite outcomes, you could make the argument that perhaps it makes most sense to focus on sort of physicalist infinitarian wager, where you might have infinite beneficent impact or beneficial impact in this world. So and I guess I might find the latter more plausible ultimately, that you
Yeah.
could do something to have yeah, such an impact in this world. Although I mean that's of course all very speculative, but I think it's a way in which one can you say, yeah, I think those are reasons why I don't find that particular wager compelling.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I always found Pascal's wager to be somewhat disturbing argument,
Yeah, in what
because
sense?
it has like eternal hell in it. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
the original version of Pascal's wager was about like eternal heaven and eternal hell, right? You lose infinite if you do not believe in God, right? If God exists. So that seems to me like really disturbing thing. And to me, the I would disqualify it as an argument, because I think if you already acknowledge that God is like going to do infinite suffering to someone, then there is some sense in which like he's God would be probably not good, you know. So maybe you might think like you would gain in infinite heaven, by wagering on God and believing and following that religion, but it could be that uh, you know God, like 100 years later, uh, just sees you do something wrong in heaven, and then you again go to like eternal hell just 100 years, later. Because it's like the implications of a god who is willing to give eternal torture to someone. I mean, it obviously does not sound like a good god, right? Because yeah.
But is the evidence for a good God stronger than the evidence for a bad God, assuming that one thinks the idea is possible in the first place?
I would think that, like, since I believe in God, and like I have looked into like the literature of philosophy of religion, and arguments and stuff. So I would say like the evidence for a good God is stronger than bad God. That's my view. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I mean, if God is already bad anyways, then if you wager or not, he might torture you anyways. If he like does not give a crap about anyone other than himself, right?
Well, yeah, but I suppose someone who had a different view might think that you could still try to plead with a sadistic God or the like.
I mean,
But
it depends on like what are your assumptions about that sadistic God, right?
yeah,
Because I mean, if God you have already given like he can torture someone infinitely, wouldn't you also like there are some religions, traditionalist views of those religions in which you know like apostasy or atheism, agnosticism are considered grave, very grave sins that deserve death penalty right now, you know, right? That deserve brutal life imprisonment or something. So it is more consistent that a god who does infinite torture to someone will also do awful things, awful other things, right? Like those kinds of things where like very little wrong, very trivial kind of wrong leads to eternal torture. And maybe not doing much wrong can even lead to that. Depends on like what God thinks is wrong, right? So, I mean, yeah.
yeah, and I guess that's a whole difficult issue how one would gain knowledge about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suppose like I can recommend some books that I liked, like, like there's a book by Josh Rasmussen. He's a Christian. He's a universalist like me. So he's an optimist. He does not believe that God sends people to like eternal kind of hell or anything. So like he has released a good book, When Heaven Invades Hell. That's the name of the book. you know and there are other philosophers who are like theists who are also yeah, optimists. So I think more and more philosophers recently are like, I'm seeing there is this optimism, you know rather than like belief in like uh, eternal hell, right? I'm seeing more and more philosophers to be saying that atheists and agnostics will go to, yeah, uh, heaven, the good place. you know yeah. So I mean, more in the current times, contemporary times, modern times, people are more compassionate, it seems to me, at least, less afraid of God, I suppose.
Yeah, but could that then be an indication that they might be, in some sense, projecting their own values?
That might be true, but I think there were still, I should mention that in historical, there were people in the history, many people, I think, like, who were like universalists, who were like these optimists, who believe that
Right.
eventually all shall be saved. Like, there is like people like in the church, some people, like some church uh, fathers or something. Again, I'm not a Christian, so I don't know much, but like there was like a few people who were important in the church who were like this optimists. And along with that, there's also like the the pessimists who believed in like eternal hell, like during that time, like, so for instance, Augustine. Have you heard of Augustine? I think you might have heard of him.
Sure.
Yeah. So Augustine like wrote that there were many people who were like compassionate and were like universalists who believed that eventually everyone shall be happy, you know. Yeah. So I think it's not like only in current times people are like doing this,
Right.
people in the
Yeah,
past. Yeah.
but people in the past might still reflect their own, perhaps partly compassionate values, or one might also,
Yeah.
perhaps it also fits in terms of how they would just like to think about a consistent, compassionate God, what they would do. But yeah, I mean, so one thing, I mean, I guess one thing to consider is like the potential risk of wishful thinking in that context,
Yeah.
which of course is a well documented tendency, and I think because one could say that that might be a yeah, like maybe an a priori reason to, or prima facie reason to give perhaps somewhat less weight to optimistic intuitions or views, that it, it it's worth being somewhat skeptical, given that there's a risk of motivated reasoning if we, as seems plausible, deeply want to be able to tell a happy story, or yeah.
But I mean, the happy story is also like the good thing about that is that it is happy, right? Like happiness
That's
is,
true.
yeah. So
But
I
or
mean,
in the sense that, well, but of course the risk there is that, like, obviously to say that something would be good doesn't mean that is necessarily true, right?
yeah, I mean that's true. But I mean, we are like consequentialists, and we believe like happiness is good, pleasure is good, right? So it is good that everyone eventually ends up happy. That's like the best thing, to be fair. That's like,
Well, that might give you an aspiration or a goal to work towards a certain kind of world, but that's of course different from saying that that kind of world is likely to be the one we're in, or that would happen regardless, and so on.
yeah, I mean that's true. What I mean is like some sort of like, of course this is like perhaps some sort of an argument for a good god. My view is like if people have like moral knowledge, then that seems to be like some evidence that a good god exists, because moral knowledge, I think, seems to me pointing towards something, you know good, rather than just, yeah. But of course there
Well,
are other arguments, yeah. So
I guess, yeah, because to my mind, um, I guess two counterpoints come to mind, where one is just that one could argue that an evolutionary framework is adequate for not just biological evolution, but also cultural evolution. Can really account for what we like descriptively would consider moral knowledge, that it's possible. And then secondly, I don't know to what extent you claim that for example, that most people have moral knowledge, but like one could, I think, make the case that most people's values are pretty terrible, and
yeah,
that most people, at least in many instances, many parts of their lives, display very bad moral character.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
yeah, those would be some skeptical arguments, I guess.
I mean, I would recommend like a great book on moral realism by Michael Humer. His book is called Ethical Intuitionism.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the book. I haven't read all of it.
Yeah, I think if you read it, I think you're going to love it. You are going to really like it because I think it's a great book, you know. Intuitionism is, I think, the best view. But of course, like Michael Humer's intuitionism is more like it has like just intellectual content, it seems to me. My view is like ethical intuitions have both like intellectual and emotional content, right? Like if you see something bad happening, that seems bad, but also it depending on how bad it is, emotions, you know, respond based on how bad the thing is, right? Like people would be more horrified of a genocide than like some guy punched another guy, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
But how does it relate to the argument for theism based on moral knowledge?
So in his book, Michael Humer, I think, says like the moral disagreements are like more based on factual disagreements. So moral disagreement are like generally more exaggerated. Like people think uh, like for example, if someone believes that there is a God who wants that child to be sacrificed, and if that child is not sacrificed, then there will be actual disaster which will kill 100 people. If someone really believes that factual thing, and they act based on that factual thing, then it is they are not acting based on moral disagreement. They do not think, hey, killing children is like, they are not thinking killing children is good. They are just thinking that we have to do this or else we will suffer, you know. So these some sorts like moral disagreements can be due to factual disagreements, and I think Michael Humer makes the case that moral disagreement is like, I think, I don't remember properly, I don't know, I think I did remember reading that Michael Humer said that the moral disagreements are generally exaggerated. We think there are these moral disagreements, but they are
Yeah.
factual, you know, like if you
But even
believe.
if we grant
Yeah.
that, I mean, so I think it's true that at least it's often true that
Yeah.
uh, like the factual disagreements are sort of at the core. I think other times it's obviously not. But like even if that is granted, I don't see how that supports like so we can say a large degree of convergence, for example, in moral beliefs.
Yeah.
That's arguably also what you would expect from an evolutionary framework. Right?
Look, I mean, to be fair, you know, that the thing is what you would exactly expect from evolutionary framework. I mean, that's I'm not sure, right? Like I don't know what we would exactly expect. I mean, from what I know about evolution, again, my knowledge is limited. I'm not an expert. I'm very amateur. From what I know about evolution, it's like survival by natural selection, and like genetics, like mutations are like random, right? So the creatures who have favorable mutations based on their environment, they are selected.
Yeah.
They live. Others do not survive. Now, I mean, I don't know how much it does that cover everything, because I mean, if like if moral disagreement is argument against moral realism, then the fact that that moral disagreement is exaggerated, I think, is not an argument against moral realism, right? Like the opposite of moral disagreement would not be an argument against moral realism, because like I think convergence, moral convergence is one argument for moral realism.
Yeah, I don't think it's a very strong one though. I mean, and as I say that as someone who has like my sympathies definitely lie with moral realism. But like you would also expect a significant degree of convergence, just like due to evolutionary reasons, right? I think your microphone is off now. Sorry.
Yeah, now it's on. Now it's on. Okay. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, the thing with evolutionary debunking arguments, I'm careful with those
Oh, it's not
because
just it's not a debunking argument really in this case. It's just like what would you descriptively predict based on you? We can even just talk about
yeah.
the traits of a species that in a relatively short time spreads out across Earth, right? So just as you can say, so we can say humans, while we differ in many respects, we also just have many behavioral and physiological commonalities, right? In terms of typically two ears and a nose, two eyes, and so on. And also just in terms of behavior, I think something like, for instance,
Yeah.
marriage rituals are, I believe, have been listed as a human universal. And I don't know whether that, I mean, that in itself, yeah, I'm not sure that has much to say about other things, but just yeah, regarding this thing about what would one predict, and just descriptively, it seems that one would expect a fairly high degree of convergence, and we also see that in many other spheres than just what we would classify as like moral thinking and moral behavior.
But I mean, if I think if that works out, then I mean, I don't know. It just gets rid of realism then.
No, it need not get rid of realism in the sense that, for example, you could do the same thing with science, for instance, right? You could
Yeah.
think that there's just a lot of convergence in terms of, well, science is a bit complicated because in some ways it's you could see it as a more recent phenomenon, but like the basic common sense processes by which humans obtain knowledge, there's probably a lot of convergence there, right? But that doesn't really mean that what the kind of knowledge that we uncover about, I don't know, it could be virtually anything. Um, the kind of knowledge that humans will tend to agree on, converge on around the world, and like the perhaps similar processes by which they arrive at that knowledge, it doesn't mean that that's invalid, just because there's convergence, right? For naturalistic reasons.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah. The discussion, I suppose, will get more complicated from here. I think. Yeah. So, I mean, since I think we are both. Uh, I think we are both like amateur philosophers. I mean, you have much more like training than I have with.
Well, I should say, and as sort of hinted earlier, I mean, I don't. So metaethics is not something that I specialize in. I used to be more to focus more on it than I currently do. But and but yeah, I do think it's worth noting that uh, I think I think one can make fairly good arguments for moral realism, carefully construed. But
Yeah.
I don't think moral convergence or agreement is a strong argument for moral realism.
Yeah.
I think
What do
it's
you
a
think
weak one.
is? Yeah. So what do you think is like the strongest argument in your view?
So I think the kinds of arguments that I find most compelling is and you know, one could start with just value realism, where I think so. I think the intrinsic, I think suffering is intrinsically bad. I think that's a, a plausible claim, and one that can, I think, only be verified through direct experience. And so I think that in intrinsic badness in its nature, yeah, you could argue that that's sort of this discloses this value in itself. It's a kind of argument also that David Pearce makes. And then, well, perhaps there is then a bit of a step going from value realism to moral realism, but I think that's a reasonably plausible step, to my mind at least, to say that that suffering in itself, that the badness of that, in some sense, like in some defensible sense, carries an ought, in the sense of it ought to be stopped, minimized, as that arguably is what, if you will, sort of the phenomenological message that the suffering itself carries.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like Neil. Have you heard of like Neil Sinha Babu? He has.
Yeah, so he defends hedonism, right?
Yes, and the moral realism he defends is based on phenomenal introspection. Not intuitions.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's fairly similar to the view I hold. I mean, although I'll probably disagree with him about um, whether there's any kind of symmetry between suffering and happiness. But
Yeah, yeah. I think I would also disagree with him. I think to me phenomenal introspection like adds, to realism, but I mean Neil's view is that intuitions are not as reliable as phenomenal introspection. Yeah.
yeah, I lean towards this same view. I do
Yeah.
think so. It's also, by the way, I think sometimes the distinction can be a little bit unclear.
Yeah.
What's introspection? What's an intuition? I'm
Yeah.
not sure it's so clear cut, to be honest. I mean, I guess the common usage of those terms probably doesn't make such a clear distinction, I would think.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, I do think that like when I've heard um, some people who consider themselves uh, intuitionists, I think including Michael Huemer, I do think that, well, at least compared to how I tend to think about ethics, I think there is a tendency to maybe rely too strongly on immediate intuitions, um, whereas I would at least give them a lot less weight and be more inclined to, um, yeah, I mean, to use those terms that you just used, like to sort of construct a more of a bottom-up framework based on phenomenal introspection. Although that's not to say that would necessarily be. I mean, obviously, you'd want to stress test any view that you would construct in that way. But ultimately, it seems to me that that is more, in some sense, yeah, more promising. And I generally find that kind of approach does, yeah, tend to result in conclusions where one's intuitions, yeah, will tend to diverge from that, but where I find that the intuitions just don't seem all that compelling for the most part. Although, and that's then again where you can make a move where, or at least there's often the plausible argument that we have certain intuitions that, yeah, in most cases they're there for evolutionary reasons, and in many cases it makes sense to act on, or at least take those intuitions into account when we are acting in practice. So much of that was perhaps a little abstract. If one takes more of an example, I mean, an example could actually be what we discussed earlier about dessert and whether that's relevant, right? So that might be a case where, yeah, from my perspective, I think the overriding concern is to reduce extreme suffering. And when there is some kind of intuition that says that that doesn't seem right in this particular case, I ultimately find that, yeah, I don't feel that those kinds of intuitions really stand up to scrutiny once you begin to take apart how the intuitions make sense for evolutionary reasons, and you would surely want to sort of act on them in a practical case, but that shouldn't really, ideally, is my view, influence your theoretical stance.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do find phenomenal introspection to be important. You know, it can be like hierarchy of values. So like due to phenomenal introspection, avoiding extreme suffering is really the most important thing. You know, due to phenomenal introspection and also intuitions, giving that kind of, so we have like two so two methodologies, phenomenal introspection and intuitions. And if we use both of them at the same, if we use both of them, then our conclusion would be that there is like a hierarchy of uh, values such that avoiding extreme suffering is the most important thing, you know. And then other values can be like, you can set up other values and stuff. But of course, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's I agree that that's something that, like, one can, I think, increase, you could say one can increase one's confidence in a view, given, like, based on how many, like, lines of evidence, so to speak, support it.
Yeah.
And it's true, right? You could have intuitions. One could, if one makes a distinction, also talk about like intellectual arguments, and maybe also cases of like witnessing extreme suffering can also, one might say,
Yeah.
that's something that relates to, again, intuition. So yeah, I agree that a strong priority, or an overriding priority even, to the reduction of extreme suffering can certainly be supported in many different ways. And then regarding what you said about other values, yeah, I mean, I just maybe again wanted to stress the point that, so for example, even if one's only concern at a theoretical level were to minimize extreme suffering, it would still, at a practical level, one would still end up, related a bit to what we talked about earlier about virtues and so on, that one would still end up endorsing many other values, right? Because
Yes.
like, it
Yes.
sort of relates to the decision procedure aspect, right?
Yeah.
That you would in that case still, not just virtues, but like also
Yeah.
generally, norms of cooperation and so on, you would adhere to. So yeah, I think that's worth stressing. And conversely, if one does, because it can be a bit, in some cases it might be tricky if one does give, for example, lexical priority to the reduction of extreme suffering. An argument there might be, or like a claim is that then, at least it seems, that in practice the other values that one might have at a theoretical level might practically always be trumped. And I mean, of course, there might be ways to deny that, in the sense that one could have, one could give lexical priority to the minimization of suffering at an axiological level, but then still also hold that, morally speaking, it's not necessarily our only duty to minimize suffering. That one might think there are perhaps non-consequentialist duties. So like that's many people don't necessarily think that. So people who are non-consequentialists don't think that ethics is just all a matter of minimizing this value or maximizing value, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Okay, so we are hitting 2 hour mark now. So I think this is it for our discussion. By the way, stick around because I want to like ask your feedback after this. Yeah.
Sounds
So
good.
let me stop recording now.